All right, welcome to another deep dive. Today we're taking a closer look at a really fascinating figure, Sidney Hook. And, considering you're someone who's already deep into the world of philosophy, I think this is going to be more than just a typical biography, right? It's like we're going to be exploring a fellow philosopher who really grappled with these core questions, knowledge, ethics, society, all against the backdrop of some seriously major shifts in the intellectual landscape of the 20th century.
Yeah, exactly. You really hit the nail on the head
Yeah.
there. I mean, to really get Hook, you got to picture the kind of philosophical world he was operating in. Think early 20th century Deweyne pragmatism was like the big thing, offering this whole different way of doing philosophy. But then Marxism starts gaining traction, presenting this powerful alternative way to look at history, society, all that. And Huck, he's right there in the thick of it. He gets super close with John Dewey, so close, people called him Dewey's bulldog.
Dewey's bulldog. That kind of paints a picture, right? Like you can almost see him fiercely defending those pragmatic ideas. So tell me, why is this bulldog image so important for understanding Hooke's early work?
Well, it shows just how deeply rooted he was in pragmatism, especially in the beginning. But here's the thing. Our goal today is to kind of trace how his thinking developed.
Yeah.
We'll look at how he wrestled with pragmatism itself, how he first explored, then ultimately criticized Marxism, how he built his own ethical naturalism, and oh yeah, how he became this huge public intellectual.
Yeah.
It's been quite a journey, like watching someone grapple with the big question and even change his mind along the way, which is always interesting, right?
Yeah, definitely. Always exciting to see how a thinker's ideas shift over time. So, to kick things off, where should we start with Hooke's journey?
Let's start with, his philosophical roots, big influences.
Right.
Right? He studies with Morris Raphael Cohen, first at City College, solid grounding there. Then he goes on to do his doctorate with, well, none other than John Dewey at Columbia. And this leads to his dissertation, The Metaphysics of Pragmatism, published in 1927. And the context here is super important, especially for someone like you, someone who's already familiar with the ins and outs of pragmatism. See, Dewey was trying to do something really interesting. He was trying to create a kind of naturalistic metaphysics in his book, Experience in Nature. And Hooke's early work is grappling with what all that means.
So for those of us who are, deep into pragmatism, it's crucial to remember that it wasn't like this totally unified school of thought, right? You've got Peirce and James who were, well, let's say a bit skeptical of traditional metaphysics, almost anti-metaphysics in a way. And that really contrasts with Dewey, who's actively trying to construct a metaphysics rooted in the natural world.
Exactly. Peirce and James, they were all about making philosophy more like science,
Yeah.
focusing on what you can actually observe and test. So they were really wary of traditional metaphysics, which they saw as too speculative, too focused on things that you couldn't really verify. They even talked about how philosophers were too busy looking backward for these supposed necessary presuppositions. Pragmatism, for them, was all about looking forward, all about the practical effects of ideas in our experience.
And then Dewey comes along and he's trying to build a bridge, so to speak, right? He's saying, look, science doesn't just happen in some vacuum. It's part of this bigger natural world. So understanding how we know also means understanding our biology, our psychology, even the social stuff, right? The things that actually make knowledge possible.
Right on. Dewey's trying to pinpoint these really general pervasive features of human experience, but he's doing it within the natural world. He was hugely influenced by Darwin, evolution, this whole idea that the mind isn't just passively taking in information, it's actively interacted with the world, trying to adapt to control.
Yeah.
It's a tool, right?
That's where Hooke jumps in and really makes his mark early on. He's zeroing in on a huge question, and it's one that still gets debated by philosophers today. Does the scientific method, this thing we use to understand the world, does it rely on certain metaphysical beliefs?
And what's so cool about Hooke, something any philosopher who thinks about the foundations of science would find interesting, is that he says, nope. He says the scientific method works because of what it produces, the results, not because of some pre-existing beliefs about how reality is structured. He even went back to this much later in his essay, The Quest for Being. He was convinced that you don't need to accept specific metaphysics to do science. He recognized that, yeah, there are these broad features of experience we all share, kind of like an empirical metaphysics, describing what's generally true, but he insisted these aren't doctrines to be proven or facts to be scientifically verified, not in the old-fashioned way of thinking.
So he's really emphasizing this idea of human agency, right? We're not just passively observing some preset reality. We're actively shaping the world, changing it. This was a big deal for pragmatists like Dewey and Hooke.
Absolutely. That focus on transformation, it was at the heart of Hooke's whole project. It pushed him to move past abstract metaphysical debates and see pragmatism as this vibrant philosophy that could really drive social change. And how? By using the scientific method systematically to make things better.
Okay, so we've seen how Hooke approached the metaphysics of pragmatism, but any philosophy worth its salt has to have a theory of knowledge, right? How did Hooke defend the pragmatic way of understanding how we know things?
This was a crucial part of his whole philosophical outlook. And being Hooke, he set up his argument by contrasting pragmatism with two big rivals, the correspondence theory, a cornerstone of realism, and the coherence theory, a favorite of the idealists.
And for a philosopher like me who's always thinking about these different approaches, what was the big advantage of the pragmatic approach?
Well, for Hooke, it was the only theory that could truly explain why knowledge matters to us, why we value it so much. It's not just about having a bunch of true beliefs, it's about what those beliefs allow us to do. Pragmatism says that true hypotheses, they're like tools. They help us make accurate predictions and even control aspects of our environment.
So the correspondence theory might tell us that truth is about accurately representing reality, like mirroring it. But it doesn't really explain why that's so useful, why it's important to us as human beings. It leaves us as that passive spectator that the early pragmatists, people like Peirce and James, were so critical of.
Exactly. Hooke, building on Dewey's work on experimental inquiry, stressed that knowledge is, at its core, about prediction and control. It's an instrument. Even with more sophisticated versions of the correspondence theory, like Tarski's semantic theory, Hooke thought the pragmatist insight that knowledge is active and instrumental that was still the key to understanding why it matters in our lives. And, to be fair, Hooke, along with Dewey and folks like C.I. Lewis, they did see the value in the correspondence theory trying to connect language and beliefs to the real world.
But they thought it didn't capture the whole picture. And then there's the coherence theory, right? Where truth boils down to whether your beliefs fit together logically. What did Hooke think about that?
Well, he saw a big problem there, especially when you're thinking about a world that's always changing, a world of contingent events. See, for a philosopher, the pragmatic critique of coherence is really important. Yeah, internal consistency is great for logic and math, but pragmatists argued that it's not enough for truth in the real world. Things happen, things change. It's not all derived from some set of perfectly consistent axioms. The coherence theory, from a pragmatist view, often assumes a kind of idealistic metaphysics, like the world is all part of some absolute mind where contradictions just can't exist.
Okay, so for Hooke, truth wasn't primarily about your beliefs being logically consistent. It was about using a specific method, the scientific method, to test hypotheses, see if they hold up in the real world. This ties back to that core pragmatic idea. Knowledge has to work, it has to have practical results.
Exactly. And, Dewey and Hooke, they saw this direct connection between successful inquiry, to actually changing things based on your hypotheses, their whole theory of knowledge. They even found parallels with Darwinian biology, seeing the human mind itself as this evolved tool, getting better at prediction and control over time.
And Hooke wasn't just theorizing about this, right? He was deeply committed to using this pragmatic approach to tackle real-world problems, especially social and political issues. He really believed that scientific inquiry, with its emphasis on testing and seeing consequences, could be applied to what he called the problems of men.
And this is huge for understanding where Hooke's thought was headed. I mean, sure, there's a lot of agreement in the natural sciences, but look at politics, society, it's all disagreement, right?
Yeah.
But Hooke had this core faith in what he called critical intelligence. It's like a broader version of the scientific method, rational, open-minded, focusing on evidence, and being willing to change your mind when the evidence says you should. He believed this could be the key to resolving even the toughest conflicts, and his pragmatic theory of knowledge was the foundation for all the work he did in public debate, which got pretty controversial at times.
And this brings us to his early interest in Marxism. He saw it, at least initially, as a good example of using a scientific method to study social and economic history.
Right. Absolutely. Hooke was initially drawn to Marxism because he thought it could offer a powerful way to understand and maybe even fix the problems he saw in capitalist societies. He saw this scientific approach to analyzing historical and economic forces at play. He even found parallels between the pragmatic view of truth as instrumental and Marx's idea of changing the world, which is famously expressed in his Theses on Feuerbach.
Ah, yes. That famous line, philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. It really captures that pragmatic spirit of action and results.
You got it. It's not just about contemplating the world, it's about actively transforming it. For Hooke, this wasn't about rejecting theory, but about a kind of knowledge that's rooted in action. The validity of your ideas is tested by their real-world effects. He made it clear, especially early on, that he wasn't seeing Marxism as some kind of inevitable historical process. It was more like a hypothesis, something to be tested and either confirmed or disproven by what actually happens.
And even in those early days, he made a point of distinguishing his view from the more rigid deterministic versions of Marxism that were popular at the time, right? Like the dialectical materialism you saw in Soviet Marxism. He started to see that as almost like a secular religion with its own set of dogmas and things you just weren't allowed to question.
Right. He was constantly pushing back against the dogmatism and determinism in Orthodox Marxism. He believed that pragmatism offered a more flexible, empirically grounded way of understanding how societies change. He called it a science of history, where even revolution is like Dewey problem solving. You're taking deliberate action to address a problem based on a hypothesis about the causes and the possible solutions, and you're testing that hypothesis by taking action.
His book, From Hegel to Marx, seems crucial for understanding this period of his thought. It wasn't just a straight history of Marx's ideas, right? It was almost like he was arguing that Marx's work ultimately led toward a kind of experimental social science that was surprisingly compatible with pragmatism.
For someone interested in the history of ideas, like you, From Hegel to Marx is fascinating. Hooke traces Marx's intellectual path, how he started with the young Hegelians. By looking at this specific lineage, instead of just focusing on Marx's later economic and political writings, Hooke could make a stronger case for connections to pragmatism, especially that experimental approach to social science. He was subtly suggesting that just as pragmatists moved beyond Hegelian idealism towards a more naturalistic understanding of the mind, so too did Marx move toward a more materialistic and potentially scientifically verifiable view of historical change.
And then there's toward the understanding of Karl Marx, which came out a few years earlier. That seems like his most direct attempt to really bring together these two seemingly different intellectual traditions, show they're not actually that incompatible after all.
Yeah, in that 1933 book, Hooke makes his strongest case for aligning Marxist theory with pragmatism. He kept portraying Marx's work as this critical and experimental science of history. The central hypotheses of this science, he argued, would be rigorously tested by the interplay of technological development and how class structures evolve within capitalist societies.
But then, as the 1930s progress, we see the rise of these brutal totalitarian regimes, both in the Soviet Union under Stalin and in Nazi Germany. And this seems to mark a huge turning point for Hooke, a point where he breaks with Marxism.
You're absolutely right. The horrors of Stalinism and Nazism had a profound impact on Hooke's thinking. And, it's interesting because he was one of the first to really criticize both systems, which put him at odds with a lot of the American left, who were initially more sympathetic towards the Soviet Union.
And he recognized the unique danger of Nazism, right? He refused to just dismiss it as a temporary phase of capitalism, like some Marxist theorists were doing at the time.
And for someone like you, who's thinking deeply about the role of evidence in philosophy, Hooke's story is a great example of intellectual honesty. He's willing to confront facts that challenge his own beliefs. He saw the brutality, the expansionism, the sheer irrationality of Nazism, and he knew it demanded a response. He just couldn't make sense of it within the framework of Marxist historical analysis.
His book, The Hero in History, published in 1943, seems to be a key step in his move away from Marxism. He looks at the role of individuals like Lenin as event-making heroes, which directly challenges this core Marxist idea of historical determinism, right? The idea that history unfolds according to these big, impersonal economic forces.
The hero in history was a turning point, you could say. Hooke argues that Lenin's choices, his actions, were essential to how the Russian Revolution played out. It wasn't just some inevitable result of economic forces, as Marxists would argue. It highlights the importance of individual agency and chance events in shaping history, something that Marxist theory, with its emphasis on structural factors, has always struggled to explain.
And in the end, the difference between how pragmatists and Marxists verify their ideas became too big a problem for Hooke. Pragmatists, they look at concrete experimental results. Marxists, well, they often seem to prioritize revolution and advancing a particular historical narrative.
Precisely. The gap between Hooke's predictions, based in part on his early Marxist leanings, and the harsh reality of Soviet oppression and Nazi aggression, it was just too wide. That empirical disillusionment, along with his deep commitment to Deweyan pragmatism, with its emphasis on open inquiry, evidence, and testing, it led him to abandon Marxism. It simply wasn't a workable framework for him anymore.
So this journey leads him to a pretty strong defense of ethical naturalism. How did he go about grounding morality within this pragmatic framework?
Hooke's ethical naturalism was rooted in Dewey's idea of bridging the gap between beliefs about the world and beliefs about values. He flat out rejected this traditional separation of facts and values. He argued that what is and what ought to be, they're deeply connected, inseparable.
So morality isn't some separate transcendent thing, right? It emerges naturally from our experience and our understanding of the world, especially human nature itself, our needs, our capabilities.
Exactly. Hooke, drawing on Dewey's work in The Quest for Certainty, saw good as tied to desirable.
Hmm.
But it wasn't just about what any individual happens to desire in any given moment. It's about what we ought to desire, based on a careful and empirical examination of human needs, interests, and well-being.
And this idea of ought, this prescriptive element, it wasn't just imposed from the outside. It was grounded in the facts about our desires and their consequences, right?
Exactly. Hooke emphasized that moral norms come from understanding those basic human needs, the deeply held interests, the desires that we have as human beings living in social and natural environments.
Yeah.
He built on Dewey's point that words like desirable, likable, enjoyable, they're not just fleeting feelings. They involve prediction. It's about understanding that others, if they have similar capacities and find themselves in similar situations, might also find these things enjoyable or desirable. And it's about reflecting on the broader consequences.
So ethical norms, for Hooke, they're not subjective feelings or random preferences. They're more like empirical predictions, well-grounded hypotheses about what rational, informed individuals would ultimately desire and value if they're thinking about the consequences.
Precisely. And these norms, understood as predictions, could be tested, even confirmed or disconfirmed through experience by analyzing their consequences. He believed that a broad understanding of the scientific method could and should be used to figure out which ethical hypotheses are best, especially in tough areas like social policy, economics, education. Of course, he acknowledged that applying scientific methods to areas with values is, complex. There are methodological issues and criticisms to consider.
And all of this becomes even more important when you consider the rise of anti-naturalist ethical theories after the horrors of totalitarianism and genocide in the mid-20th century.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The scale of suffering and brutality in World War II and under those totalitarian regimes, it made a lot of philosophers question whether ethical naturalism was even adequate. Some felt it painted too rosy a picture of human nature. Some turned back to religion or intuition for moral guidance. Some even argued that original sin was the best explanation for how humans could be so evil. Others went for existentialism, emphasizing individual freedom and the apparent arbitrariness of moral choices in a world without God.
So Hooke, as a pragmatist and a naturalist, he pushed back against all of these alternatives.
Yes, he did. He rejected moral absolutism, whether it was based on religion or some supposedly self-evident metaphysical system. And he rejected moral relativism and nihilism, the kind associated with existentialism or some interpretations of logical positivism. Against the existentialists, he argued that ethical judgments have to be judged by their consequences, their impact on human well-being, not just by how strongly someone feels about them. And against the positivists who saw ethical statements as just emotional outbursts, he emphasized Dewey's distinction between prizings, which are those immediate feelings of approval or disapproval, and appraisals, which involve actually thinking about the object or action, considering its consequences, and relating it to our values.
His engagement with C.L. Stevenson's work on ethical disagreement seems really relevant here. Stevenson argued that moral disagreements are mainly about different attitudes or emotions, not about conflicting beliefs that we could resolve rationally by appealing to facts.
What's interesting from a philosophical point of view is how Hooke responded to Stevenson. He agreed that emotions are important in moral judgments, but he pointed out that we often overlook the role of factual disagreements. We might think we agree on values, but we could have different, maybe even unexamined, beliefs about the facts of the matter. And those beliefs can influence our attitudes. He argued that we can never be absolutely sure we have all the facts, and new evidence can change even our deepest moral convictions. Plus, even if we seem to agree on an attitude, that doesn't mean we've really resolved the ethical issue, especially if that agreement is based on things like coercion or manipulation, rather than a shared, rational understanding of the facts and their consequences.
So Hooke was always focused on how we can use ethical naturalism to understand and deal with real social and political problems. He wasn't interested in getting bogged down in purely theoretical debates about the meaning of moral language or the ultimate nature of moral facts.
Exactly. Pragmatism was always pulling him towards seeing ethics as a set of tools for navigating life's complexities and tackling the challenges we face as societies, not as a rigid system of rules or principles.
And this naturally brings us to Hooke's role as a public intellectual, which was pretty significant and often controversial. He didn't just stay in the ivory tower, right? He jumped right into the biggest debates of his time.
Hooke was a major voice in American intellectual and political life for decades, starting in the 1930s. He came up with this idea of ritualistic liberalism, a critique of what he saw as an overly rigid, almost blind defense of individual liberty during the Cold War.
Right.
He argued that we need to balance those freedoms with the need for social order and national security, especially when there are real threats.
But even though he criticized some aspects of liberal thought, he always defended core liberal values, right? Like civil liberties and racial desegregation. Although his later views on affirmative action definitely sparked some debate.
Absolutely. And his thinking about education evolved too. Early on, he supported progressive education reforms. Later, he emphasized a more balanced approach, stressing critical thinking skills and a solid grounding in the Western humanistic tradition. This comes through in books like Education for Modern Man and his essay Philosophy of the Curriculum. He got worried that focusing too much on relevance and rejecting traditional learning could actually make people less informed, less able to think critically about the world.
And as he reevaluated socialism, especially after seeing its failures in practice, a lot of people saw him moving towards a more conservative kind of liberalism, maybe even neoconservatism, in his later years. But he never gave up on that core commitment to pragmatic inquiry, to evidence-based reasoning.
Yeah, and his work on academic freedom is super important, especially when you think about the threat of anti-democratic movements. His book, Heresy, Yes, Conspiracy, no, it's all about drawing that line between the freedom to hold unpopular views and the need for a democracy to protect itself from groups that are trying to undermine it. It's a tough question that still gets debated today.
And then there's his work with the American Committee for Cultural Freedom and the Congress for Cultural Freedom during the Cold War, which shows just how strongly he opposed Soviet totalitarianism.
Those organizations were key in promoting anti-communist thought, both in the U.S. and internationally. They provided a platform for people to really examine Soviet ideology and what it was doing in the world. Of course, the fact that they received funding from the CIA later on caused a lot of controversy, raising questions about intellectual freedom and the influence of government. But it's worth noting that the publications associated with these groups often criticized American policies too, both foreign and domestic.
It's interesting how he engaged with thinkers from all over the political map, like Friedrich Hayek. It shows how his views on the relationship between political and economic systems were evolving. He started out believing in some form of socialism, but his later experiences led him to a more nuanced position. He even criticized Hayek's economic determinism, and his own economic views seem to have changed during his time at the Hoover Institution.
And in the 60s, with the rise of the New Left, he founded the University Centers for Rational Alternatives. That really reflected his concern with finding a balance between necessary social change and preserving intellectual and educational values in universities. His later positions on things like affirmative action, which he often defended based on his ideas about individual rights and equality under the law, they solidified his image in those later decades of his career.
It's amazing that even late in his career, when he was president of the American Philosophical Association, he chose to give a speech about the tragic sense of life from a pragmatic perspective. He argued that a mature pragmatism can acknowledge suffering and loss without falling into pessimism or naive utopianism.
That presidential address really captures his mature pragmatism. He recognized that life is precarious, that suffering is inevitable, that we face moral dilemmas without easy answers, but he didn't think this meant we should give up on reason, inquiry, and working to make things better. He saw this realistic acceptance of life's difficulties as compatible with a strong humanistic naturalism. We can acknowledge our limitations, recognize that there are no guarantees, and still work towards a more free, just, and rational society.
So, looking back at this incredible journey, this vast body of work, what's Sidney Hooke's legacy? Where does he fit in the history of pragmatism as a whole?
Well, there's this common story that pragmatism went into decline after World War II and was only revived much later with neo-pragmatism. But Hooke is a perfect example of why that story is too simple. His work shows how relevant and powerful Duane pragmatism remained throughout the 20th century.
He was someone who bridged that gap between the public intellectual engaging with real-world issues and the academic philosopher deep in theoretical debates. He was both.
Exactly. And he wasn't just repeating Dewey's ideas, he was testing them, refining them, adjusting them based on new evidence, new arguments, new historical developments. He might not have always agreed with every detail of Dewey's thought, but he stayed true to that core pragmatic method, applying intelligence to the problems of our time.
And it's interesting, despite his huge contributions, he's often overlooked in contemporary accounts of pragmatism.
Yeah, that's a bit of a puzzle, isn't it? Scholars like Cheryl Missack are doing great work challenging that eclipse narrative and showing the links between classical pragmatism and what came later in analytic philosophy. But Hooke's specific place in that story, it still needs more attention. He's a vital link showing how alive and adaptable pragmatism was throughout the 20th century.
So to wrap things up, Sidney Hooke gave us this dynamic, evolving interpretation of pragmatism. He engaged deeply with Marxism and then moved away from it. He laid out a strong case for ethical naturalism, and he was this tireless public intellectual tackling the big questions of his era. His story is a great example of a philosopher who took ideas seriously and really thought about their consequences in the world.
Exactly. And we see those aha moments throughout his work. His idea of knowledge as a tool for action, his efforts to bridge science and ethics, his early warnings about the dangers of totalitarian thinking, his understanding of freedom and its limits in a democracy.
And for you as a philosopher, I think Hooke's journey is really thought-provoking. His willingness to change his mind, to revise his beliefs based on evidence and good arguments, and his commitment to applying philosophy to real-world problems, these are all qualities that are worth reflecting on, right?
Definitely. And this brings up a big question for you. How would Hooke's approach, his emphasis on critical intelligence and looking at consequences, how would that apply to the debates we're having today? Think about the tension between individual freedom and security in our digital age, the role of ideology in politics, the very idea of truth in a world where it seems like everyone's in their own echo chamber. What parts of Hooke's work, his experience in the 20th century, might be useful for a philosopher trying to understand and navigate the 21st? I'd encourage you to dig deeper into Hooke's writing, explore his work, and see how his ideas might still be relevant today.
I think that's great advice. Sidney Hooke, he might not be a household name, but his ideas are still worth grappling with. And who knows, maybe they can even help us find our way through some of the big challenges we're facing today.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the thought of Sidney Hooke.
Absolutely. And thanks to all our listeners for joining us as well.
Until next time, keep thinking,
Keep questioning.